I have helped thousands of grapplers all around the world get strong, reduce their risk of injury, and improve their performance on the mats. I'm going to condense everything that I've learned about optimizing your performance for grappling in this one video. The 3 critical areas to jiu-jitsu performance are strength and power, mobility and stability, and your jiu-jitsu gas tank or your cardiovascular fitness. Lifting weights is the number one thing that you can do to reduce your risk of injury on the mats. 68.8% of grapplers will experience at least 1 2-week absence from training in a 3-year period due to injury. Strength training specifically for combat sport and contact sports, including grappling, is the number one way to reduce both chronic and acute injuries. So if you're lifting weights, if you're doing some form of strength training protocol, you're less likely to have an acute injury, and you're also less likely to suffer the long-term impacts that grappling has on your body. How many training sessions should you be doing? Well, 2 to 3 sessions per week is enough to get the performance benefits and the injury reduction benefits for grappling. Now, there's not a whole load of research on grappling specific sports science in injury risk and on reduction and strength training and the like, but there is some. We can also lean on research done on other sports that are similar to jiu-jitsu, like judo, wrestling, other contact sports like rugby even is relevant. And of course, mixed martial arts is thrown in there as well. So there's enough research for us to conclude that strength training is not only going to be one of the best things you can do to improve your performance, but is also critical if you care about longevity on the mats and if you care about staying in the sport for a long time. Just because your favorite grappler or your favorite jiu-jitsu internet personality doesn't lift weights doesn't mean that it's a good idea. When you're assessing whether or not to implement a strength and training protocol or anything new into your routine to try and improve your performance on the mats, you need to take a look at the research, listen to what the experts are saying, and then draw your own opinion about what this internet personality or whoever is telling you, including me. Here's the thing. One of the biggest mistakes that grapplers make when they're trying to train for jiu-jitsu performance is training like a powerlifter or a bodybuilder. One of the first things that people do when they want to get strong for jiu-jitsu is they think, okay, who do I know are strong? What type of athlete is a strength athlete? Or powerlifters, of course. So you go ahead and you find a powerlifting program and you start following it. This is not a good approach for grappling. There are many reasons why powerlifting is not fit for purpose. But if we think about what powerlifting is a strength sport. Grappling is a completely different sport. So training like a powerlifter is not necessarily going to give you the most benefit for grappling. Now, that's not to say that powerlifting is completely useless. Of course it's not. We can borrow a lot of foundational techniques and a lot of concepts from powerlifting. Namely, we can take the compound movements, even their accessory movements. But powerlifting programs are designed to get you strong in the big 3 lifts: the bench press, the deadlift, and the squat. Whereas a grappling strength-based program should be designed around getting you strong in the movement patterns and in the muscle groups that are going to have the most transferability to the mats and to your sport. It also should be designed to support you in terms of stabilization and strengthening the muscle around your joints. Another common mistake is training like a bodybuilder. I'm not saying that bodybuilding, again, similar to powerlifting, is useless. However, oftentimes it's not fit for purpose. One of the main drawbacks from bodybuilding specifically, that it's not designed for grappling, and oftentimes it's too high of a volume, meaning you're training too much for you to adequately recover from, particularly when we're including a decent grappling training schedule on top of that. Bodybuilding can be beneficial for grapplers that need to stack on some muscle. Larger muscles are generally stronger. So stacking on muscle will definitely help. And if you're trying to increase in a weight class, again, this can definitely be of an advantage for you. So bodybuilding per se is not necessarily bad, but just following a cookie cutter bodybuilding style program may not be the best option for you. Now let's look at the opposite end of the extreme. If you are training in the gym and are trying to make all of your exercises look like jiu-jitsu or judo techniques, then you're doing something wrong. This is a terrible approach. You've probably seen these exercises where guys grab their gi, chuck a resistance band around it and start throwing it around, trying to do hip throws or whatever. This is not an effective use of your time. There has been no research to support these movements for being superior in terms of developing your strength. And you're also not getting better at the technique. The only way really to get better at doing a hip throw in a gi is to do some hip throws in the gi, not to chuck a resistance band on a power rack at the gym and swing it around like an idiot. Now, that is a little bit of hyperbole, but when you're in the gym, you should be focusing on exercises that have the greatest transferability. An example of this could be, instead of doing your resistance band hip throws, focus on your push movements, your pulling movements for the lower body, your hip hinge, your squat variations, your lunge patterns. These movements are going to have the greatest transferability on the mats. If you're looking for more specific exercise examples, I've done a whole video series on the best exercises for grapplers, and I've split it up into movement patterns. As a quick run through, I recommend focusing on upper body, the horizontal push, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull. For the lower body, I recommend focusing on hip hinge, squatting patterns, lunging patterns. Those are going to be the movements you should focus on. What exercises in those movement patterns? We'll start with compound exercises and then build out from there. Now let's talk about how to actually put all this together. How should you structure a program for strength? Well, there are many different forms of periodization or program structure. Periodization can be thought of as a systematic approach to your training protocols designed to develop desirable athletic adaptations with the greatest crossover to your sport. It's a fancy way of saying your program structure to drive results. That's pretty much it. In periodization, we want novelty, but we also want a form of structure. That means that you shouldn't go into the gym and do something brand new every single time, but it also means that you shouldn't stagnate and stick with the same old exercise, the same old reps, the same old weight, and expect to see results. We need to push the boundary. We need to ensure that we're increasing your load each week. There's many different ways of structuring a program to accomplish that. Here are my two preferred methods for grapplers. The first is block periodization. This form of periodization groups your training into blocks. Each block represents a period of time, and that period of time has a focus. The focus can shift from things like strength, then the next block could be power, and then the next block could be conditioning focused, general physical preparedness or GPP. The blocks in unto themselves can have periodization within them, but the entire program structure follows the block format. The next method is known as condensed conjugate method. This is an adaptation of a powerlifting protocol developed by Louis Simmons, and then it's been modified and condensed by Phil Daru for his MMA athletes. I've borrowed this system and applied it to my grappling athletes, and it is highly effective. The way it works is days 1 and 2 focus on strength and power. With day 1 could be upper body strength, maximal effort, followed by lower body dynamic effort. And then the following day reverses that with your lower body maximal effort and upper body dynamic effort. This is a combination between strength and power and is done in a full body split. So you're doing a full body workout focusing on both strength and power in terms of your dynamic effort. And then on your third day, it focuses on GPP or general physical preparedness with an emphasis on your posterior chain. That's a fancy way of basically saying your back and your glutes and your hamstrings. And that is an excellent way to formulate a training program for grapplers. When I was talking about block periodization, I mentioned that there's a way of creating periodization or structure within the blocks. And you can do this for the condensed conjugate method as well. And this is a concept known as wave loading, or it's also known as step loading. Wave loading is where you step up your intensity to a maximum each week. For example, it could be week 1, 80%, then week 2, 90%, week 3, 100% maximal effort, and then you step it back down to 60% for a deload. And then you keep stacking these on top of each other continuously. This is an excellent form of periodization that I like to utilize to ensure that throughout the training block, you're achieving a deload. This is especially beneficial for grapplers because most of the time you're not trying to peak for a specific competition. You're competing within your training cycle, meaning in grappling, there isn't usually like the Olympics where you're training for 4 years and then you're going to compete. Whereas most grapplers, they are competing regularly at different weekends throughout the year. So we want to make sure that our training program has us at a state of readiness, seemingly wherever your competition falls, or you can structure it so that you are wave loading. That deload week coincides with your competition week. Why is power so significant for grapplers? Well, it applies to many different techniques and scenarios that you're going to find yourself in on the mats. Think about the last time you're stuck in bottom side control, explosively bridging out, or you're trying to do a kipping escape from bottom mount, or maybe you're going for a knee cut pass, a Toriondo pass. Anything explosive requires you to apply your technique with force and speed. Power in an athletic standpoint can be thought of as your ability to apply maximal force in as little time or with as much speed as possible. Now, to develop your power, yes, you need to be strong, but you also need to have the ability to recruit that strength quickly and apply it with maximal intensity and speed, which is why I really like the condensed conjugate method, because it includes power training in each session to ensure that you're working on your power continuously throughout your training block. Otherwise, if you're following a block training method, I recommend including at least one power block in a 12-week training cycle. Mobility and stability. Mobility and flexibility are not the same thing. Flexibility means having a greater range of motion. Think about being able to more easily touch your toes. Whereas mobility means unlocking a greater range of motion, but being strong throughout that range. Mobility is much more significant for grapplers than simply being flexible. I'm sure you've trained with someone that was incredibly flexible, but they're not very strong. Maybe they're a twig, their joints easily bend around. Maybe they can get their foot behind their head, but they can't push you away from their guard. This is not what you want to be. Yes, it can be more difficult to pass someone that is hypermobile or hyper flexible, I should say. But if they're not strong throughout that range, then they're way less effective. Now think about someone who is really strong, pretty jacked, and is also flexible and mobile. That is what you want to be. How do you achieve that? Well, there's 3 methods of improving your mobility for jiu-jitsu. The first is incorporating mobility work as a warm-up and a cool-down before and after you train jiu-jitsu. This can be a great way to warm up and prepare your joints ready to train jiu-jitsu, but it can also be an easy opportunity to get your mobility work in. If you want, you can download a free mobility warm-up and cool-down guide. Link will be in the description of this episode. For the cooldown, this is also an excellent opportunity to calm down your central nervous system, improve and enhance your recovery, work on your breathing, and get in some static stretching. The second method to improve your mobility is to do some form of strength-based mobility work in the gym. This can be by modifying your existing movements and movement patterns, or you can incorporate some specific mobility work. You can do different weighted resistance band work. You can do a Cossack squat variation, modified pigeon. There's so many different things that you can do in the gym to enhance your range of motion, but be strong throughout that range as well. The third method is to incorporate a 10 to 15 minute jiu-jitsu specific mobility routine in the morning or whenever throughout the day. Now, you can do just a yoga routine as a follow along, focusing on your particular weak area. Or if you would like, you can follow my routine that's completely free here, available on YouTube, called the 30-Day Jiu-Jitsu Mobility Challenge. Put a link to that playlist in the description. The advantage of following a mobility routine like this is it will be a fast track to getting you up to scratch in terms of your range of motion, your mobility on the mats. But grapplers have had amazing results following the 30-Day Jiu-Jitsu Mobility Challenge, and it's something that you can always come back to. Now, this area is called mobility and stability. So let's talk about stability. Stability means being able to stabilize your body in different ranges of motion, planes of movement from either an internal or an external force, whether that internal force is your own body weight or the external force being weight opposed on you, either by a sparring partner when you're grappling or a weight if you're lifting in the gym. Now, there are different forms of stability work that you can do. You can do more dynamic work, or you can do static stability isometric holds. Stability training is particularly important for grapplers. think about all the crazy different techniques that you have to stabilize your body. Maybe you have to balance on one leg. You have to stabilize against a resisting opponent. All of this requires proprioception, joint awareness, body awareness, and of course, stability of the muscles around your joint. If you don't have stability, you're going to be far easier to manipulate on the mats, meaning that your opponent is going to be able to move you and you're not going to be able to resist against that movement as easily. All of these factors combine into having less stability on the mats, and that is not what you want. Some simple examples to get your creative juices flowing are the bird dog row, a half kneeling pull-off press, a single leg deadlift. Think about work that requires you to stabilize against an external resistance, balance against your own body weight, or holding a weight, or holding a position like an isometric hold. These are all forms of stability training. Jiu-Jitsu gas tank. Just roll more is bad advice for someone who is trying to improve their cardio for Jiu-Jitsu. It doesn't tell the whole story. It's narrow-minded and it misses the complete picture. What is your Jiu-Jitsu gas tank? I define your Jiu-Jitsu gas tank as your ability to sustain a high level of output on the mats. Your Jiu-Jitsu gas tank has 3 components: your technique efficiency, movement efficiency, and cardiovascular fitness. These 3 components combine to create your Jiu-Jitsu gas tank. If you train more Jiu-Jitsu, you will improve your gas tank in the area of technique efficiency. The example I like to give is if you compare a white belt technique to a black belt technique, who is going to be more efficient in executing the techniques on the mats? Well, of course, the black belt. They know what to ignore, they know how to efficiently move their body, and they know exactly how to apply their force to get the maximum result. Applied technique is one of the most important things in a skill-based sport, and Jiu-Jitsu is no exception to this. So yes, if you roll more, you'll become more efficient, you use less of your energy reserves, therefore you will improve your Jiu-Jitsu gas tank. But this is only 1/3 of the whole picture. The other 2 elements are just as important. The second component is your movement efficiency. This ties back into our mobility and stability conversation. If you are unable to move your body through space efficiently, then you're going to be utilizing way too much energy to perform simple movements on the mats. Let's take the example of someone that has a really hard time with hip flexibility and mobility and can't get their knees to their chest. Well, you're going to have a really hard time in guard retention or guard techniques. And you'll probably find that you gas out quite easily when a lot of the time in guard, it doesn't require all that much energy at all. So improving your body's ability to move through space, you'll be utilizing way less energy stores. And the last component is your cardiovascular fitness. This area is probably where I get the most pushback. People just don't want to hear this, but research has been done on Jiu-Jitsu athletes specifically. They've compared Jiu-Jitsu athletes to both wrestlers and judokas. What they find is that Jiu-Jitsu guys have the shittest VO2 max and aerobic base of the 3 sports. And those 3 sports are fairly similar with similar demands on your body. Now, there's a lot of reasons in the research why this is the case, but one of the theories is that Jiu-Jitsu has a ceiling effect on the improvements that it can have on your VO2 max. If you don't know what a VO2 max is, it's simply a measure of your maximal oxygen uptake during exercise. So think about it as the gold standard way of measuring someone's cardiovascular fitness or how cardio fit someone is. It's measured by their VO2 max. So Jiu-Jitsu does not improve your VO2 max above a ceiling effect. And that ceiling is quite low, especially when compared to other athletic populations like wrestlers and judokas. So what can we do about it? Well, there's 2 main approaches that I recommend: VO2 max training specifically and aerobic based training in the form of zone 2 cardio. I also would throw in a 3rd method there, and that is conditioning in the form of work capacity training. And that basically means that you're sustaining the same level of work for a longer period. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. First, let's address your aerobic based training. Aerobic based can be thought of as your baseline or your floor of your conditioning. Now, if VO2 max is your ceiling, aerobic base is your floor. The best way to improve your aerobic base is to do a form of cardio known as zone 2 training. This is where you're operating in the zone 2 heart rate zone, or less than 70% of your max heart rate. Now, in order to do this training, you don't necessarily need a heart rate monitor, but it will make it easier. And you also need to know what your maximum heart rate is. Therefore, you need to do a maximum heart rate test, or you can use an estimate. I'm sure you can Google maximum heart rate estimate and find a somewhat accurate version. But if you do not have a heart rate monitor, you are not excused from Zone 2 training. You can run the talking test. Now, this specifically works for runners. If you're out for a jog, the theory goes that you should be able to hold a conversation on the phone with a friend, but they should be able to tell that you're running. They should be able to hear in your voice that you're running. I hope that made sense. The cardio modality that you do for Zone 2 training doesn't really matter at the end of the day. You can do running, you can do jogging, incline walk on the treadmill can work, pack marching, you can do a weight vest walk, swimming, assault bike, stationary bike, the list goes on. Just do one that you prefer. Now, if you want my recommendation for the gold standard that converts best for jiu-jitsu, it's probably the assault bike because it combines both upper and lower body work as a full body cardio modality. Now let's talk about your VO2 max. I mentioned aerobic base is the floor, VO2 max is the ceiling. The best way to improve your VO2 max for jiu-jitsu is the 4x4x4 interval method. This means doing 4-minute rounds and 90% maximum sustained effort. Not to be confused with a sprint effort, but your maximal sustainable effort. Now, I always get questions and people get confused when I talk about your 90% maximal sustained effort. So basically the concept is think about the fastest possible or the hardest you could push yourself for 4 minutes straight. Drop that back to 90%, repeat that 4 times through for 4-minute bouts. That's what you want to do. The reason that the 4-minute rest time is so long is because we want full recovery between bouts. Now, if you are very fit, you can start to increase the time to 5 minutes and reduce your rest time. And ideally, you get it up to the point where your interval time matches your competition time, particularly if you are preparing to compete. So if you're a blue belt, for example, most blue belts compete at around 6 minutes. So if you can slowly work up your VO2 max intervals to be 6 minutes, 4 6-minute rounds, then you're going to be incredibly cardio fit for your jiu-jitsu competition. Another form of VO2 max training is Tabata sets or shorter interval sprints. This can be a Tabata, traditional Tabata, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off for 8 rounds through, a total of 4 minutes of work time. Or you can do something like a 45-second sprint on, 15 seconds off, 4 to 10 times through, depending on your fitness level. This is another really great interval. Now, with these efforts, you're maximal sprinting, so as hard as you possibly can for the full on period, whether it's 30 seconds, 45 seconds, whatever. You can add these at the end of your strength and power workouts as a finisher if you're short for time. And the third conditioning workouts that I recommend is work capacity. There's many different forms of work capacity. You can do circuit training, which is supported in the research on specifically jiu-jitsu conditioning. You can do something like a sled push. Think about this as doing a level of sustained work for a longer period of time. So we're looking at 5 to 10 minutes of continuously moving your body throughout a sustained effort. So think about kettlebell swings, maybe box jumps, maybe you're doing a CrossFit workout is a lot of the time sustained work capacity. Also, if you do something that challenges your grip strength, this will help with lactate buffering in jiu-jitsu to stop that crazy fatigue that you get on your grips after a really hard round of sparring. Fatigue management and recovery. I recently published a full episode on fatigue management specifically, but we're going to go through some of the cliff notes here. Now, fatigue management is essential for grapplers. Jiu-jitsu has a crazy high demand on your body. If you're training too much jiu-jitsu, you're probably going to start noticing that your body's breaking down. You're unable to recover. If you're unable to recover, your performance will suffer. Therefore, fatigue management and recovery tactics are going to be critical for all grapplers. Fatigue can be defined as a phenomenon associated with decreases in physical and cognitive performance and increases in injury occurrence. Fatigue has 2 primary categories, central fatigue and peripheral fatigue. Central fatigue can be thought about as your nervous system, your central nervous system fatigue. When you're doing exercise, your central nervous system is rate limiting the amount of force that you're applying. This system can become fatigued if you're doing a lot of high neural activity. The next form is peripheral fatigue. This can be thought of as the fatigue in your actual muscles. So DOMS, right? Delayed onset muscle soreness is a form of peripheral fatigue. You will experience both from both lifting weights and from grappling. So we need to combat that with fatigue management strategies and recovery tactics. There are many different ways to assess your fatigue, but it's broken down into two primary categories: objective measurements and subjective measurements. Objective measurements are usually more expensive, not as accessible, and is usually reserved for professionals because you need expensive equipment. But some simple objective measurements that you can utilize is a HRV test, or a heart rate variability. Your heart rate variability is the time between your beats. Your heart doesn't beat on a stable metronome or a clock. There is some variance in the time between the beats. And funnily enough, the higher your heart rate variability, the better. Because think about it like this: in a chaotic environment, your body is trying to regulate as much as possible. Therefore, there's a more predictive time between your heartbeats. Whereas when you're fully recovered, your body is more relaxed, if you will, and you have a higher heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is also associated with cardiovascular fitness. You can track your HRV either during sleep using a wearable like a Whoop band, Garmin watch. A lot of these watches use sensors on your skin to track your heart rate variability, or you can use a heart rate monitor and test your HRV either in the morning, first thing, or before you train. Now, how do you do it? Well, if you're wearing a wearable during sleep, the app is going to compare it to your baseline and give you a readiness score or an indicator of your recovery. Whereas if you're using something like a heart rate monitor, I recommend using a HRV app. The one I use is called HRV Lite. It's completely free, super effective. It stores all your HRV baselines so you can easily compare between your previous scores. Or if you want to go old school, just write it down. Another form of accessible objective measure of fatigue is using your hand grip strength. There's very limited research to associate grip strength with fatigue, but there is some. So I'm going to recommend it as a useful tool that you can include in a holistic look at your fatigue. To do this, make sure you're seated, have your feet planted on the floor, have your arm at a 90-degree angle, and squeeze as hard as you can for about 5 seconds. Then record your score. Ideally, you want to do this 3 times and take the average. In order for this to be an effective measure of your fatigue, you need to establish a baseline. So doing this a few times a week to establish a baseline, and then you can compare it against what it should be. Subjective measures of fatigue are things like readiness surveys. This can be a wellness score on an app. You can just rate your fatigue out of 10 as a super basic way of doing it. The research on this is pretty good. There is a very strong correlation between your perceived levels of fatigue and your actual objective biomarkers of fatigue measured by actual biomarker tests that they've run in studies. So we can utilize a modified version of a readiness score, incorporate some jiu-jitsu specific questions in there as well. Now we know how to assess our fatigue. Let's talk about fatigue management strategies and recovery. Your recovery has 3 primary pillars: sleep, nutrition, training intensity. Sleep is the best thing that you can do for your recovery. No one wants to hear it. No one wants to talk about it because it's not interesting. You know this, but get 7 to 9 hours of sleep opportunity each night and your recovery will drastically improve. That's all I really need to say on that. Second is your nutrition. If sleep is the best thing you can do for your recovery, then nutrition is a close second. Now, John Danaher has gone on the record to say that he hasn't seen any athlete improve drastically in jiu-jitsu performance by eating better. I call bullshit on this. By improving your nutrition, you'll improve your ability to recover and you'll also improve your performance on the mats. It's not going to teach you how to do the world's best armbar, but it is going to fuel your body and help your body to recover so that when you're on the mats, you're there ready to perform. Now, nutrition is a completely separate full-length topic unto itself, so I'll save that for another day. But as a very, very quick summary, here's what I recommend. 50% of your calories should come from carbohydrates, high-quality sources. Your protein intake should be around 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. The remainder of your calories should come from fats, but make sure that it's no less than 20%, but go easy on the saturated fats. And finally, training intensity. Here, we're talking about your training schedule, your periodization strategies, and auto-regulation. Auto-regulation is a way of auto-regulating your training intensity, meaning it's a way of modifying your training intensity to meet you where you're at. If your training program has a form of auto-regulation, it can modify your intensity down to meet you where you're at so you're not in a state of non-functioning overreaching, which basically means that your training stimulus is too high for you to recover from. So you're getting worse, or you're in a state of null training where your training is essentially doing nothing. This is what we want to avoid. Forms of auto-regulation you can utilize, an easy one is RPE. RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. It's a scale between 1 and 10, with 10 being your maximum effort and 1 being zero effort at all. Easiest way to apply RPE-based training is to associate it with RIR, which is reps in reserve. So if you're utilizing RPE mapped against reps in reserve, it means 10, you cannot perform another rep on your set. 9, maybe you can get out 1. 8, you can get out 2. 7, you can get out 3, and so on and so forth. By using a combination between RPE and the associated reps in reserve, you can auto-regulate. Training schedule. This is my systematic approach for developing the best training schedule for grappling performance. The way this works is we're going to add your training in priority order, and then after we have all your ideal training schedule, we're going to start removing where required. Step 1, add your grappling sessions. Step 2, add your training program, 2 to 3 days per week. Step 3, optional, you can add your conditioning training. This is your cardiovascular fitness training. Step 4, optional mobility training. Step 5, adjust your training based on your response and life factors that get in the way. If you need to remove sessions, make sure you're removing them in reverse order to which you added them. So start with mobility, then conditioning, then your strength training if required, and finally, last case scenario, remove your grappling. By systematically adding these sessions in priority order, you got your priorities straight. At the end of the day, we're grapplers. Grappling is going to be the most important thing that you can do. But that doesn't mean that you should do an extra grappling session and drop your minimum requirement of 2 strength sessions per week, because we still need to improve our strength. Use some common sense here is what I'm saying. All right, so let's take a little aside and talk about how to prepare for a competition. With your training schedule, depending on your grappling experience, what level you're at, your availability at your gym, I recommend making sure you're doing a minimum of 3 grappling sessions per week. Optimally, or a maximal based on this schedule, probably 6. Unless you're an enhanced athlete, then go for gold. But most people are going to fall around 4 to 5 as being their Goldilocks zone. Then you add in your strength and conditioning. Do 2 to 3 strength and conditioning sessions per week. And if it's a particular weak point for you, you can add in 1 conditioning session. Alternate it between VO2 max and zone 2 training, or just do VO2 max if you have to do only 1. Do that for around 6 to 10 weeks. Deload the week before the competition. That's how you prepare for a comp. In terms of peaking for performance, yes, the strategies that you can implement to make sure that your training program peaks you on that day. But for most people, just do a deload week the week before. As for preparing on the final week for your competition, I want to give you some advice that I got from my coach a little while ago, and it makes sense to me. Basically, the advice goes like this. When you're preparing for the comp, figure out which day in a normal grappling week or normal training week that is your best day. For some people, it's the first training day of the week, maybe on a Monday. That's where they perform the best in sparring. For others, it's the second day of training. Whatever that day is for you, time it so that that day falls on the competition for you. Meaning, if your comp is on a Saturday and your best training day is the Tuesday, well, train before, train on the Friday. Maybe counterintuitive to train the day before a comp, but for some people, it will improve their performance. For me personally, I always train best on the Monday after I've had full rest over the weekend. So I always make sure that I take off the 2 days before the comp. As for post-competition recovery, well, this is an excellent opportunity to reflect on how you did, reflect on your performance, both technical performance and physical performance. You need to be realistic and be critical of your performance, but also pat yourself on the back because a lot of jiu-jitsu practitioners don't even compete in the first place. So you're already a step ahead of them. After you've evaluated your performance, you can then plan your next training cycle. And my personal philosophy is win, lose, or draw over the weekend in competitions. I'm always going to show up on Monday. There's a lot of information that was thrown at you in this video. Thank you so much for watching until the end. All the resources that I mentioned, all the free programs, and a link to my online platform, BJJ Strong Online, is in the description, and I'll put it in the pinned comment as well. It'd really help out with the YouTube algorithm and let me know that you like this style of video if you smash the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment. You can ask me a question, just show support, Everything helps. Thank you so much for watching.